Call this meeting to order. Special meeting of the Humboldt County Planning Commission. This is an odd one on a fourth Thursday of the month. There's multiple ways to participate via Zoom, which thanks to Trip for getting it going there. And there's the number on the screen to call in, also in person. Call to order, so can you please rise for the flag salute? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So, item B, commissioners present. Can we please get a roll call?
Ivor Scovdell,
Present.
Noah Levy, Thomas Mulder,
Here.
Peggy O'Neill, Sarah West,
Here.
Jerome Karazi,
Here.
and Lorna McFarland.
Here.
That gives us a quorum, so we'll come on to agenda modifications. Director, are there any modifications to the agenda?
We have no modifications this evening.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to item D, public comment on non-agenda items. So at this time is the opportunity to speak on items that are not on our agenda but are in the Planning Commission's purview. I'll start with in person. Would anybody like to make it to the podium to speak on non-agenda items? Seeing no one making a move towards the podium, I don't see any hands up on Zoom. It looks like we only have one attendee on Zoom. Am I reading that correctly? Okay, so we're gonna move past public comment on non-agenda items and go to consent calendar, which, if I read this correctly, yep, there's only one item. So DC Eden Dispensary and Distribution Facility, conditional use permit and zoning clearance. Is there anyone from the commission that would like to pull that and have a hearing on it? Okay. It's been requested to have a hearing on it, so being as there's no other consent item, is it okay if we move that up and do that in items pulled from consent right now?
Would ask that we do that so we can release the other staff who are here just for that item.
Okay, let's do that if we can get a, are you requesting a full staff report?
No,
Okay.
but I do have questions for staff.
So, do you want to, in the past, we've done at times just ask the direct questions or go into a staff report. Which do you prefer, Director?
I think just going to direct questions would be fine. I just want to emphasize this is a situation where these uses were previously approved on the site. There is an active permit there. The permits were revoked by the Board of Supervisors because the operator had abandoned the site and left the site. There's now a new property owner who has taken over the site and would like to take on the uses. So we're really bringing it forward to allow a transfer of the permit to a new applicant operator. Be happy to answer questions on that.
Go ahead with your questions.
Thank you. To staff, so my first question was, it wasn't clear to me if there are planned alterations in this project or modifications to the building that would be classified as alterations under building code. And if so, would they potentially trigger requirements for EV charging stations per 11B in the code?
Well, that's a good question. There are no exterior alterations. I think they may make some minor alterations inside the building. They haven't really shared any plans to do that with us. So as far as whether those would rise to that level, I think that's something that we don't know yet, depending on what they do. They haven't actually filed for a building permit or anything to do those adjustments yet, and it may be that they don't need any.
So I guess that would come with the building permit if so. Okay. Thank you. And then my other question was, it appeared that there are actually residences within 300 feet of this project, and I was just curious if in that last permit round, they were notified. Were there any objections from residences within this project?
And we did send out notices for this hearing.
Correct, it went to everybody within 300 feet. So like you mentioned, there are some residences there that are within 300 feet. For a dispensary and a distribution, they don't have the same setback requirements as cultivation. So really the limiting setback requirement is if there's a school within 600 feet, which there's not.
Okay, I had, unfortunately, the section numbers are super long, but I had read that 55.4.6.4.4.1.2 did have, so if, I may have been misunderstanding that, but did have that setback requirement. If it does, I think I would maybe request acknowledging that in the resolution.
Like Mr. Johnson said, that I believe is a setback requirement for cultivation.
Okay.
And so these are interior uses, don't have the same setback requirements.
Okay, that sounds good. Those were all my questions. I appreciate it.
Does anybody else have any more questions?
Since we're asking questions, I was just curious, approximately what period of time has it been since the previous tenant or operator ceased business and this new one's starting up? I mean, has it been
Yeah.
years or months?
No, it's, we don't know exactly, but their state license expired the beginning of last June. And so and we had inspected them at the very beginning of the season, so I think in April or something like that of last year. And at that time, they did appear to be open. We don't know if they were actually open to the public. But their state license expired over a year ago, so
Around a
it's
year.
pretty clear.
Okay.
It's been at least a year. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
And there is a detailed report about it in the revocation staff report. If there's any more. Since we technically opened it up for a hearing, we need to give the opportunity for the public to speak, and starting with if the applicant had anything they wanted to say. I'm not seeing the applicant in the room or on Zoom. I don't believe there was any opposition that I heard, so I don't feel that the applicant's losing their opportunity to due process. But is there anyone within the room that would like to speak on the DC Eden Dispensary and Distribution Facility? Please come to the podium. Seeing no one moving towards the podium, I'm going to ask if anyone on Zoom would raise your hand if you had anything you wanted to say on this project. Seeing no one raising their hand, I will come back to the commission and see if I can get a motion to approve.
I'll move to approve the DC Eden dispensary project.
Okay.
I'll second that.
Okay, we have a first and a second to approve. Can we get a voice vote? All those in favor say aye.
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 Anyone opposed? Any abstentions? 2 absent. Okay. So now we get into public hearing, draft tiny house village ordinance and draft emergency housing village ordinance. Just clarification, the process, are we gonna try to go line through it, or just kind of try to get the initial walkthrough, clarifying questions from the commission, take public comment, and then come back to the commission? It doesn't matter to me either way.
I would ask, Chair, that you allow us to give a presentation, which includes, we'll go through the ordinance with the changes and the alternatives that have been provided, take public comment after that, ask clarifying questions, then take public comment, and then come back to the commission for additional questions and discussion.
Okay, so then I guess I would ask the commission to err on the side of caution and not lean towards alternatives until after we take in the public comment. So that way we aren't making a decision before we've given the public the opportunity to speak. Okay, so I'll turn it over to staff.
All right, good evening, Commissioners. My name is Megan Acevedo, and I am presenting the Tiny House Village and Emergency Housing Village Ordinance, or ordinances. The original draft of the ordinance included a combined version of the Tiny House Village Ordinance and Emergency Housing Village Ordinance that's being presented to you today. That ordinance, the original draft, included addressing Housing Policy 31, allowance for tiny house villages, and the implementation measure 40, which also includes allowance for tiny house villages, and implementation measure 58, which includes the allowance for alternative lodge parks. So after the first public hearing that we had as a public workshop, it became clear that there was some misunderstanding about what the intent was for each ordinance, and so we've decided to separate that out into two ordinances. And so now we're presenting today the Tiny House Village Ordinance and the Emergency Housing Village Ordinance. And the Tiny House Village Ordinance is, the intent of this is to encourage housing diversity and expand lower cost housing developments in Humboldt County. This would allow for tiny house villages, which include tiny homes and movable tiny homes. And this also allows for dependent unit villages, which would be more of a sleeping unit that may not include a kitchen and bathroom. The Emergency Housing Village Ordinance is to allow for housing developments that meet emergency housing building standards, and those are lower standards to the California requirements for permanent housing. And these developments are specifically to be used for persons experiencing homelessness. This ordinance allows for emergency dependent unit villages and alternative lodge parks. So the definition for tiny house was already in our Humboldt County Code, was added through the ADU ordinance. And so here's the definition for a tiny house. It's a structure intended for separate independent living quarters designed as a permanent year-round residence for one household. They're typically under 400 square feet, have at least 120 square feet for the first floor interior living space, and include all basic functional areas, kitchen, bathroom, etc. A movable tiny house is also already existing in our Humboldt County Code definitions. This is like a tiny home, but could be transported on wheels and is under 400 square feet, requires 120 square feet for first floor interior living space. We have included some definitions for this ordinance, the tiny house village, and that is a grouping of 3 or more tiny houses or movable tiny houses. This would also include dependent unit villages with 3 or more dependent sleeping units that would require central sanitary cooking and dining facilities. And tiny house village would be considered multifamily housing and not a mobile home park or an RV park or a special occupancy park. We have also included these definitions for a dependent unit village and a dependent sleeping unit. The dependent sleeping unit is a hard roof and sided structure providing a minimum of room for living, sleeping, and is not fully equipped with a kitchen area, shower, and toilet or sewage disposal system, but it may contain a bathroom. We have also included some definitions for the Emergency Housing Village Ordinance. This is the emergency housing villages and emergency dependent unit village. And after discussing internally, we would like to request to add some language to these definitions to specify that these are to be used for persons experiencing homelessness. We have also included alternative lodge park and emergency sleeping cabin to our definitions. The alternative lodge park provides spaces for occupancy, allowing a broad range of housing types. And that would include manufactured homes, mobile homes, recreational vehicles, travel trailers, tiny houses, movable tiny houses, cars, and temporary camping facilities. The emergency sleeping cabin is the same as the dependent unit. Sorry, I'm drawing blank. It's very similar to the other definition. This structure, however, would have less building code requirements, and would only need to meet emergency housing building standards for an emergency sleeping cabin. Here I have provided, didn't realize these were all independent. This is a list of all of the areas that would allow a principally permitted tiny house village or dependent unit village. That includes residential zones, R3, R4, and U, with residential medium or residential low land use designation, and mixed use urban. And I've provided a preliminary map, take it with a grain of salt, but this shows some areas that have potential zones that could be used for these type of developments as principally permitted sites with connection to water and sewer. And that came out to approximately 850 parcels. Here is some areas that are zoomed in for principally permitted areas that may be allowable. We have Redway and Garberville in the upper right, and Hydesville in the center. And the highlighted areas are the potential zones that could be developed for this. Here is a list of all the zones that would allow for conditionally permitted tiny house villages and dependent unit villages. And the map shows parcels that could potentially allow for these type of developments within Humboldt County. And these would not require connection to water and sewer services, but would require permits with the Department of Environmental Health for on-site wastewater treatment and water. This came out to approximately 5,000 parcels, but I think there are more than that. I would have to do a more thorough research, though. So changes that were made in the tiny house village ordinance, we have included density bonus provisions to outline what you could do to go above the 20 per acre limit. I have included an alternative to remove the density requirement. However, we don't recommend that. I've included an allowance for renewable power systems to be permitted with the building division. Outlined parking standards for transitional housing and senior citizen housing. And we've included some alternatives to reduce parking requirements for sites that are within a half a mile of a transit stop. Alternative has been included for open space requirement, provisions to enhance privacy, and alternatives for bathroom facilities requirements for dependent unit villages. Things to consider, if we would like to include additional provisions for kitchen facilities, and, do we want to put a number on how many sinks or stoves or area for refrigerator space that would be provided for dependent unit villages? That hasn't been included in this draft of the ordinance. The same for allowances for pets. That hasn't been specifically identified in this ordinance, but we do have requirements already in our zoning code. and I think it's typically 2 pets per parcel. Or one per, 2 pets per unit, sorry. And something else that was not included in this draft of the ordinance is allowing commercial zones as principally permitted. That is something that we can consider today as well. And also potentially reducing the parking standards that have been added. Here is a map of, let's go back, of sites that could potentially allow for emergency dependent unit villages as principally permitted with connection to water and sewer. And that's R3, R4, and MU1. Came out to approximately 700 parcels in this query. And here's our list for zones that would allow for emergency dependent unit villages as conditionally permitted. And that's residential zones, mixed use zones, commercial zones, and industrial zones. This map, unfortunately, I wasn't able to get a query of all of these zones, and it's specifically showing the commercial zones in Humboldt County. And just because the allowances for alternative lodge parks are slightly different, I included a slide for this to show the specific zones that allow for alternative lodge parks. And alternative lodge parks are only allowed with a conditional use permit with connection to public water and sewer. Changes that were made to the emergency housing village ordinance, we removed the density limits. We've included allowances for renewable power systems, and an alternative was added to remove the allowance for generators. There's no minimum parking required for emergency housing, and there's an alternative for open space requirement. We've added in the use of common facilities to on-site personnel and occupants only as an alternative. And yurts and cars have been included for alternative lodge parks. And I have also included a provision for how to clean up the site in the event that an emergency shelter declaration is no longer active. Public comments that we've received were on the density limits for tiny house villages. Parking requirements are considered too high for tiny house villages. Considerations about how the county could collaborate with funding sources for the emergency housing villages, and questions regarding the property ownership requirements for emergency housing villages. And just to briefly touch on that topic, we've done some thorough research, and there's no specific language that requires the emergency housing to be on county-owned or leased property. And that is the end of my presentation, but I will go through the ordinance now. And I will just go through the inland version. Small. Okay. So we have tiny house villages, which includes tiny homes or movable tiny homes. We have the types and numbers of structures that are allowed, so 3 or more. Tiny homes or movable tiny homes. And here's the section for density bonus provisions. These provisions already exist in the code, but we wanted to specifically show them here so that people know that this is an option to go over the 20 units per acre limit. And to get more specifics about the allowances, you'd have to look at that ordinance. So we have alternative 1, which removes the density limit. As I said, we don't recommend that, but it is an alternative. And then here I've updated the language for water and wastewater requirements. However, here in section 62.3.3.1.2, there's an error that says emergency housing villages, and we'd like to correct that to say tiny house villages. And as well, we've added in here a definition for Safe Drinking Water Act, but we'd like to also alter that language to just specifically say wastewater treatment and water that meets county code and state requirements, to leave it more open to the Department of Environmental Health to do their review and see what's required. Here's where I've added the provision for renewable power. We do require access on roads and driveways that have a minimum width of 20 feet, and that's required for fire safety access. Addresses are required. Here we're showing 1 parking space per unit required on the site, unless you meet some of these other models. So a tiny house village or dependent unit village could include transitional housing model or a senior citizen housing model, which have separate requirements. These are already existing in our zoning code, so this is just specifically showing those requirements. And then I've added in alternative 2A, which reduces the 1 parking space per unit by 50% when a tiny house village is within a half mile of a public transit stop. Alternative 2B reduces that parking requirement even further to 70% when a tiny house village is within 1 mile of a public transit stop and 1 bike rack per unit is provided. We have waste removal and composting requirements. So here is where the open space requirement is, a minimum area of 1,500 net square feet to be provided for 1 acre of tiny house village. We've included an alternative, and this was due to our second public workshop. There was some input about allowing for common areas for workspace and recreational buildings, and so I've included this as an alternative. There we go, sorry. I've also included a provision for privacy. I thought this might be appropriate to attempt some sort of design standard. So this is just saying that a window from 1 unit shall not be placed directly into another window of a neighboring unit. We didn't want to add too many design standards because we really do want to leave this open for the developer. And these are just the development standards for movable tiny houses that are already existing in our code. I've just outlined them here in this ordinance. And these were included in the last version. So here we have dependent unit villages. And these would just include multiple dependent sleeping units that are not fully equipped with a kitchen area, toilet, or sewage disposal system. And they are required to have separate on-site facilities that include, but are not limited to, kitchens, bathrooms, and sanitary facilities. This could include other facilities as well. We have the zones that are allowed, which we already went through. I guess I didn't really touch on the section 62.4.2.3, which does not allow for short-term rentals or any occupancy of less than 30 days. And that's because we really want to make these for permanent residences. Here are the requirements for common use facilities in a dependent unit village. I've included an alternative to reduce the requirements for bathrooms and bathing facilities, as that was one of the comments from our last public workshop, that it was too high and maybe costly for developers. And those numbers are really flexible. I really just thought of what I thought would be appropriate and made sure with building that that was in line with what building codes require. And that's it for this ordinance. I will now bring up the emergency. Oh. Uh-oh.
Sorry, that was wrong of me to say that.
I don't know what happened.
That's just a screen sharing.
Sorry. Okay. Here's the emergency housing village ordinance. So we've just outlined that all units under this ordinance are required to meet the minimum standards for emergency housing in the building code, which are now Appendix P and Appendix AZ. I know in the last ordinance it said Appendix O and Appendix Z. These have now been updated. We've included the applicability section here to make sure that this specifically states it's for persons experiencing homelessness. We've also included requirements for operators. So we felt that it was appropriate that an emergency housing village shall be operated by a government agency, religious institution, nonprofit charitable organization, or private nonprofit organization. And no individual or household shall be denied shelter because of inability to pay. I made the same changes here as the last ordinance, and so we are requesting to make those same modifications to the language just to make it more open. And I've included the provision for renewable power source. It's the emergency housing appendix that also allow for generators, and so that's included in 62.5.3.2, and the alternative removes that, so that's for your discretion to decide if generators should be allowed for emergency housing or not. Access requirements are the same. Here we specify identification and not addresses, and that's in line with the housing, emergency housing building standards. And we have no minimum parking requirement. This section as well, 62.5.3.6.2, I think we also want to take out just the Title 14 of the California Code and just kind of leave it more open to whatever regulation applies at that time. This is the same alternative in the last ordinance to increase the area for common recreation and open space and to allow for up to 25% of that to be used for common buildings and workspace. And alternative 3, this was in the last ordinance. I've I've included it here as an alternative because I know there were some commissioners that wanted it removed, and so I just wanted to leave that up to your discretion. And then common facility requirements. Emergency dependent unit villages. This allows for 3 or more sleeping cabins, emergency sleeping cabins. And then we have alternative lodge parks, which are only allowed with a conditional use permit. So this is the last addition that I put in this ordinance, is the provision for the removal of a site in the case that a shelter crisis declaration is no longer valid. So that concludes my presentation. And I'm available for questions.
So I'm going to turn it over.
I'm sure we all have questions, it looks like. So maybe I will just start with my questions specifically on the tiny house village section, and then I'll come back to my questions on the emergency housing village section later. So I think just for the tiny house village section, top of my mind is why staff is not recommending the reduction of the density requirement, or the Yeah, can you talk a little bit about like staff's recommendation on the density requirement?
From my perspective, the density requirement is really in line with what is allowed in the general plan. It's a little less than 30 units per acre, but 30 units per acre is for land use designations of residential medium, and residential low only allows for up to 7. And as well, we think that with the density bonus provisions, that incentivizes allocations for low income, very low income, and senior citizen housing.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I think Ms. Acevedo is absolutely correct that we heard a lot of comments about it not having an affordability requirement. And so trying to walk that line between when do you require things to be affordable and when not to. And the way the current code is structured is it has the density bonus provisions. And so utilizing that to incentivize some affordability for higher density is the thinking there.
Thank you. That was my only question on this section.
Can I follow up? Do we have the ability to increase those bonus provisions? When we say 20 units per acre, 10% of the total units are strict to get the bonus. 10% are for low income, that would be 2, and 5% are for very low income, that would be 1. That doesn't seem like much of a challenge for increasing density.
Yeah, I think the commission could, within this ordinance, create a higher level of affordability than what the density bonus ordinance would require. Normally, if you're not going to modify another ordinance, you don't address it.
Right.
So here, one of the things, if you wanted to modify it, we could modify that here and have a higher affordability requirement.
Okay, thank you. I think that's something we might want to consider.
Thank you. Are there any other? Go ahead.
Are you suggesting considering it in conjunction with the density or in place of the density alternative?
I'm saying that if we keep in order to exceed 20 units per acre, they have to go for this density bonus, and that we increase the criteria for the density bonus.
Okay.
to require, you know, more affordable units. If that's, you know, that's a goal. I would just say, like, comment on these tiny house villages in general. I mean, I know there's a lot of interest in creating them with the thought that they will help provide more affordable housing, and particularly housing for the unhoused. But this is a planning zoning regulation, and once created, I mean, there's a whole movement of people moving, you know, to minimalist lifestyles that would be interested in purchasing tiny homes. There are college students that would be interested in perhaps living in tiny homes. There's traveling workforce that could be potentially living in tiny homes. So these tiny home villages aren't just going to be for the unhoused.
Yeah, and that's why I was seeking the clarification on if you wanted to, if you were supporting or not supporting the alternative one, which removes the 20 per unit, because exactly what you said, if it's a traveling nurse who wouldn't meet the low income requirements, but are you saying it would be better to have increased density?
I'm saying that to get increased density, we should require the units to be affordable. If we take away that requirement and just allow increased density, you can have increased density, but they won't necessarily be affordable or available.
If I understand the question correctly, what it would do is, if you're looking at 62.3.1.1.1, currently says 10% of the total units are strictly for low-income households. That number could be changed to 20%, 25%, or some other number that you're choosing here. So it's increasing the number of affordable units in exchange for the increase in density.
Gotcha.
Through the chair, if I could.
Go ahead.
I'm trying to share my screen, but it's not popping up. You can also stack these, so you could, you know, designate for low income and then designate for very low income. And here, let me zoom in here. So this shows you, if you allocate 5% of units to very low income, you get a density bonus of 20%. And then you also get a incentive or a concession here. How do I make this larger? There we go. So this shows the table in the density bonus ordinance, and this is for very low income. So if you allocate 6% of units, you get 22.5% added to the density. And so you'd have to do the math to see how many units that allows you to have. But I think you can go above 30, you know, depending on how you stack these.
How does that table relate to this paragraph? So,
I think what is intended to kind of be a shorthand for that table, and I think what we'd really need to do, if the commission's interested in pursuing a different percentage, is then to import that table with the fullness of the table with the numbers the commission's interested in pursuing.
I mean, I know it's a balance. The developers are going to say that the cost of the development precludes them from having units that for very low income or low income. So if we push too hard on that, we might not get a tiny home village developed at all. But if we don't push hard enough, if we don't push at all, then we're not going to get the low-cost housing. So
There's clearly a balance, and I will say that in the 8 years that I've been working here, nobody has come in and requested a density bonus.
Interesting. Okay. So after public comment and we bring it back, we can dive into that table potential modification. Go
So
ahead.
could I just
Go ahead.
make a comment? You know, and perhaps that speaks to the fact that the density bonus ordinance doesn't provide enough incentive.
Okay.
So that you may think about requiring a higher degree of affordability, but the corollary to that would be to provide additional incentives also.
There has to, I mean, it has to make sense on paper to be able to do it.
Can you give an example of some of those incentives?
Well, some of the incentives would be, that are typically provided would be density related, so a higher number of additional units in relationship to the number of, the percentage of affordability. It could be a reduction in parking, could be, and often in multifamily contexts, it's a reduction in open space, reduction in landscaping, reduction in setbacks. Those are all things that reduce development cost.
Okay. So are there any more questions in the tiny house village? Go ahead.
Under the mechanical equipment section, I was curious why you stipulate that no mechanical equipment can be located on the roof. I'm curious what the motivation was for that.
That was already included in our accessory dwelling unit ordinance, and that is a building code requirement. Yeah.
Is that all your questions, or do you have?
I do have, I think so.
Go,
One more.
go ahead, ask away.
Thanks. Still orienting myself, myself here. Is the intent of the dependent villages the homes that are allowed in there are tiny houses as defined in the current code? Is that the intent?
It could include a tiny house. The idea was that it doesn't require a bathroom and a kitchen facility, and could be supportive housing, transitional housing, some other model of housing that provides common facilities.
Does the maximum square footage requirement apply to dependent unit villages?
No.
Okay, there's just less constraints on the type of building that's allowed in a dependent unit village?
Correct.
Okay. And also, are the parking requirements intended to be the same for dependent unit villages?
In this draft, yes.
And also as well as the minimum open space requirement. So those
Yes.
are those intended to be flow down, I guess, to
Yes.
those? Okay,
Correct.
thank you.
For the dependent units, is there a maximum number of occupants per unit? And I'm just asking because your alternative 4 about, changing the bathroom and shower facilities, I'm just trying to do some rough math in my head if we're trying to allocate a certain number of facilities per occupant. So I'm making the assumption that there's single occupancy, but that's not correct, right?
We don't have specific requirements for occupancy, but from my thought, it's ideally for no more than 2 persons.
Okay, so we should, when we're reading your alternative 4 about the bathroom and shower facilities, kind of make the assumption that there were
A
2.
maximum of 2 per dependent unit.
Okay, and then at some point, I thought it might be helpful to review the changes slide that you had up that went through these, but I also want to check with the rest of the commissioners if that's like appropriate to do now or if there are other questions first.
I think what we do plan to do is go back to the ordinance after the public comment and just walk through the ordinance and talk about it line by line, or however granularly you want to talk about it.
That's fine. I can wait for that part then.
Okay, so then any questions for the emergency housing ordinance? And I know there's a couple here. Commissioner West.
Yeah, I think my primary one was for alternative lodge parks, like, and I'm sorry if you've already explained this and I missed it the first time around, but why must alternative lodge parks connect to water and sewer when we have exceptions for all of our other types?
I think the idea there is that we don't really know the occupancy number for an alternative large park. It allows for multiple types of units, and so it could allow for more units than a septic system can provide. And it also kind of poses a public health and safety issue if we have a septic tank that's not properly sized.
Wouldn't that be addressed as a part of the permitting process? Like, especially when you're talking about, I guess we are talking about structures that don't necessarily have building permits associated.
It could be. I mean, the alternative lodge park, it has a high degree of variability, and so that's why the conditional use permit. It could be that part of that review looks to see whether or not it's suitable for septic and or well provisions, and that can certainly, change can certainly be made. I think part of our struggle was looking at where these would be best suited, and they'd be best suited in areas where there are services that not only water and sewer, but other kinds of services. And that utility connection was kind of one of the best ways to grasp that.
Is that everything?
Just more of a clarifying question, if I'm understanding the structure of 62.5. So are we really envisioning two types of emergency shelter villages, alternative lodge parks? And so those are the two types. Okay. And yeah, I think that was actually my primary clarifying question. Thank you.
Do we have any other clarifying questions before we go to public comment? Okay, so at this time, I'm going to open up for public comment. I'm going to start with in person, so anyone who wants to make comments, please come to the podium, and we'll keep it at 3 minutes. I'm not going to try to cut it down or anything like that. But please be mindful of your 3 minutes.
Hi, thank you for the time. Ken Hammock, Indigenous Habitat Institute, working to bring fire retardant hempcrete insulation to Humboldt County. We're involved with a lot of international conversations with new technologies that are coming out right now for housing. And the rooftop disallowance for technology on top of the roof, I would argue amend that to allow that. I know personally of some new wind technology, it's micro wind, that's like solar efficient, that goes on top of structures, tiny structures like this, that would make these things very energy efficient. So I would ask that that would be allowed, like energy efficient types of applications on top of the roofs. And the other thing is people look at the villages and developers present their ideas. If there's any competition or clauses that require them, the best bids to be the most energy efficient, I would love to see that in our community, because that's where the technology is going. It's readily available, and if we encourage people to use these technologies, it'll make us all better. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Anyone else in the room would like to speak?
Hi, My name's Diana Livingston. I have a question about the C3 zoning. Is that, you have C1 and C2. We have a property that's C3Q. It also has the earthquake thing in it, and I'd like to know for tiny houses, one of the things we've observed is that something on wheels, if it's tied down correctly, it doesn't incur the same damage that some other structures might. So I really am asking a question about if C3Q is an allowable, and I'm not talking about this for emergency housing, I'm talking about it more permanent.
After all the public comment, we'll come back and answer all the questions.
Okay, thank you.
Is there anybody else in the room that would like to speak on this? Going. Okay, so I'm gonna move to Zoom. Please, it's *9 to raise your hand, I believe. I'm surprised there's at least one of these people want to comment. Yep, there we go. Nezzy Wade, hopefully I'm enunciating your name correctly. *6 to unmute.
Yes, can you hear me? That's correct.
Yes, we can hear you.
I have a question about the emergency housing, tiny house village, and that is, Megan indicated that this does not have to be, the political subdivision of the county, being a county ordinance, does not have to be consistent with what I would believe to be the state law that says that in order to use the shelter crisis declaration, it has to be property that is owned, operated, leased, controlled by the political subdivision, which in this case would be the county. How do we not have to do that in this ordinance?
So all questions will be answered at the end of public comment. We can't do back and forth during public comment. It's a violation of the Brown Act. Do you have any more that you would like to add to your comments?
I guess I only have one chance to speak. Altogether, I guess I have some concerns that I would like to speak to, and that is, it seems there's a lot of questions that are unanswered about all the entities who can do these projects, and some more specific information might be needed on what the processes might be for how to undertake creating an opportunity for a community to have a tiny house village that is affordable at the level of, our small rural communities as well as any other community in Humboldt County. A lot of these things are by design and seem to be sculpted from the top down, and I'm wondering how grassroots movements, mutual aid, and communities that consist of civic and social organizations, churches, would be able to step in and do this as a collaboration. There isn't a lot that's specifically identified for how you go about doing this. I'm wondering if there seems to be a piece missing for how to actually implement this ordinance. I think we went through the same thing with the safe parking, safe sheltering ordinance that was not used. It was passed and then not implemented, and that was because it was not an easy thing to do. There was not a clear pathway. I'm really thinking that we should spend more time trying to figure out
10
a
seconds.
really workable approach to this.
Thank you for your comment. We have a temporary technical difficulty. I don't have the Zoom link on my computer. It's doing this buffering connecting thing. So
I see no other hands up right now, Chair.
there's no other hands up?
Nope.
Okay, so we will close public comment and bring it back to the commission. Part of me is leaning towards we do like a 5-10 minute break and then dive into it, so that way not trying to rush through it and get it done in like 30 minutes. So 10-minute break.
10-minute break, and then for the people who did ask questions, we will respond to questions after the break.
Okay, sounds good. So 7:09, we'll be back.
Record. Recording in progress.
Okay, so we're back in, and we're at the commission for discussion now. So I would think we would do this one ordinance at a time, like do the tiny village or tiny home village ordinance and then the emergency ordinance walking through. Would that be the appropriate way?
Yes, it would, Chair. But before we do, I'd just like to respond to a couple of questions.
Yes.
So a comment was made about the rooftop prohibition, and examples were given about fixtures that would generate renewable power, and certainly those would not be restricted in that. But we would have no problem even taking that out, because that's going to be whatever the building code is going to allow in terms of the rooftop equipment, and we don't necessarily need to prohibit it for building code purposes, because building code's going to do what the building code's going to do. It may be also an aesthetic consideration, but we're trying to make things as efficient as possible, so we can leave that out. The other thing, the question was asked about a C3 zone, and we have been working simultaneously, and the commission has had a workshop on allowing residences or residential uses within within commercial zones.
Hello? Hi, Andy. Is it on right now?
How do they? I,
Sorry. So we are proposing as part of that ordinance to allow residences in C1 and C2, and as Ms. Estato presented tonight, it probably makes sense to accelerate that allowance within this ordinance and allow tiny home villages in at least C1, C2. We were not going to allow it in C3s, simply because C3 kind of is commercial industrial a little bit. There's a lot more intensive use allowed in the C3. May not be as compatible with a residential use, although it could be conditionally permitted. I'm going to then move down to, the comment was made about a lot of unanswered questions about process and who can do this. And one of the things that we have intentionally tried to do is leave who can do it as open as possible. So if a church wanted to do it, a nonprofit wanted to do it, some benevolent person wanted to do it, they could do it. And so we're not regulating who, we're regulating what happens on the land. And so the other thing that we're trying to do is make it absolutely as simple as possible. That's why in some zones, these are permitted by right, which means you don't need to go through a separate discretionary permit process. They don't have to come to the Planning Commission. They don't have to go to the zoning administrator. They just need to get permits to construct the units. And so that is just making it as absolutely simple as possible. And since Natalie Duke got to spend many hours struggling with the question of whether or not it has to be on county property, I'm going to ask her to answer that question.
Thank you, Director Ford. So we did spend a long time analyzing the government code section 8698.4. And that, what it does is it relaxes the building code standards for the qualifying types of structures. And it allows for emergency housing on, as the commenter said, county-owned or county and city-owned land. And it also allows for those to occur on, in homeless shelters reserved entirely for the homeless, as defined in the section, and is defined pretty broadly as a facility with overnight sleeping accommodations, the primary purpose of which is to provide temporary shelter for the homeless that is not in existence after the declared shelter crisis. So while there's a shelter crisis, our determination is that if it qualifies as a homeless shelter, those types of exemptions from the building code requirements can also be on public land for qualifying structures during the shelter crisis. And private land, sorry, I meant to say private land if I said public. Public and private land. And we took a deep dive into the legislative history of this section as well, and determined that that is how we're going to interpret this here. And that's consistent with what we did a couple of years ago too for the safe parking ordinance.
Thank you for that. Are there any other clarifying questions or staff wants to do before the commission dives in? I think that's everything. Commissioner Curiosi, is that correct? I always think I'm going to fumble that one.
No, that's perfect. 4 syllables. Quick question, Director, your comment on who can develop, and I think it does state, we do specify nonprofits, churches, et cetera in here. So are you proposing to remove that
No,
portion?
I'm sorry. That's what's in the ordinance is what we're proposing.
Thank you, Chair. Just one more comment. I probably should have said this earlier. I did miss the April workshop due to a conflict, but I wanted to disclose that I did watch the video of the Planning Commission meeting, listened to all the public comment, read all of the public comment that's been submitted, which I appreciated, and included some of the attached documents and videos. So just want to let people know that. Thank you.
Thank you for the reminder. I appreciate it. But likewise as well, I also missed that meeting, and I did watch the video of that meeting and read the public comment as well.
Thank you for your dedication. I guess I didn't disclose. I've talked to a handful of people, some pro, some against, and just different things about the tiny village. I mean, I've had this extreme is like, hey, we need more density, and then as extreme as no more tiny houses at all. So it's kind of all over the place. Nothing substantial though. As far as the process, so we're gonna walk through the ordinance. Should we just start walking through the sections and then try to get to alternatives and see? I guess I would ask this, the commission, does anyone have any questions up until we get to alternative 1, or do you want to walk through that language?
If we could share screen.
Sure. I will. I do have a question, and I think it does involve the percentages, which Commissioner Skavdal was talking about earlier. But I did have a question about the 10% and the 5% numbers and how it relates to a recent legislation that was signed just last year, and the whole fire hose of housing-related bills that showed up last year. But ABU 1287, and I was curious if those percentages aligned with that recent resolution.
I don't think we looked at that because we were taking this out of our existing density bonus ordinance.
Okay. I think that legislation actually may require increasing those percentages, but.
Okay.
So right off the bat, we need to, look at what 62.3.1.1.1 and 62.3.1.1.2, because that was a early discussion as far as changing those. Correct?
That is correct, and perhaps it would make sense here, rather than try to rewrite this, because there is really a table that needs to be imported, is for us to get some general direction from you in terms of the nature of what you'd like to see, we can look at the Assembly bill that was referenced and make sure that we're consistent with that, and then come back with a proposal. And I would also ask that it can be as general as just saying, you know, we don't believe that 10%, 5% is enough. But we want to increase that, but we're also willing to give some additional incentives in order to see those accomplished, unless you have specific numbers in mind that you would like to provide.
I guess I'll start before we get into that conversation. I'm actually in favor of alternative one and removing the incentivization for affordability and a limit on density. I think that the less barriers to building housing, the better. And it's a greater benefit to affordability to allow more housing on a property than it is to use the incentivization process. So that's where I'm coming from. If it's the will of the commission to look at that, I would be in favor of increasing the incentives to push people that direction, but I would love to see the density requirement removed personally.
I'm going to take the alternative view. I'm not supportive of alternative one, which is basically an unlimited density or just leaving it up to the developer to propose a density on the parcel. I think the biggest challenge on getting these tiny house villages implemented is going to be, frankly, neighborhood objection. And we don't hear that here tonight, obviously, but as soon as one of these is proposed, we're going to hear from the neighborhood. And I'm looking for ways to demonstrate to those neighborhoods that we've considered the impacts and tried to manage and control impacts to the neighborhoods. And I think that by having a density limit of 20 units per acre, but allowing developers to go over that if they're providing more affordable housing into the community is a good approach to that, and something that I could support when the neighbors are standing up here in front of us to say why they shouldn't do this. So I'm in favor of leaving the density limit, excuse me, of not exceeding the 20 units per acre unless they meet the criteria for a density bonus. And what that density bonus should be, I'll leave up to the planning department to help us figure out.
I think I would like to see a proposal from staff on a table. I think I definitely am interested in ways to achieve more density, including increasing the maximum density prior to any incentives. And I think also noting that we're restricting this to a particular building type that we can't build up, right? So we're not going to get multi-story density projects here. So if we don't specify the density, I think that potential for, a significant impact to a community may not be as large as other types of developments.
I think that I hear what you're both saying, but I'm leaning a little bit more against alternative one, simply because I do live in an unincorporated area, and I understand the comment about not building up, but the other impacts, which include just the massive amount of cars and traffic through an area, or the strain on the resources. And so I'm not completely convinced, my mind's not made up, but that is the way I'm leaning.
So, now that everyone spoke, this is the fun part about being chair. You have to wait, bite your tongue. So, for me, I'm not supportive of alternative one. I want to, like, I hear everyone about, like, not. We'll just have a rotor hammer in the back. It's all good for me. I hear everyone's concerns about trying to limit the barriers, but I also want to, like, I have this dream that we'll have these incentives that'll encourage these developers to take the incentive bonuses or to get more development. So I would like to keep that in place and not take out alternative one. As far as, it'd be nice to have something back from staff, just throwing a number out there or throwing a dart at a dartboard. Basically, I would think maybe moving 62.3.1.1.1 10% and 62.3.1.1.2 to 10%, just to try to really incentivize those, and those are just rough numbers. As far as I know, the intention is, I just want to clarify with staff, the intention is to provide direction and not try to pass this ordinance tonight, correct?
Correct.
Okay. All right.
So if I could offer, since you're kind of 3-2 right now, I think we're going to bring back alternatives for both, because likely at our next meeting, there will be 2 additional commissioners here, and that could swing. So it's not that we're not hearing what you're saying, but want to be sensitive to how 2 more commissioners may affect the thinking of the commission.
It could go 4-3.
Is there a way that we can formally request that they either watch this hearing or review the material before the next meeting so they're adequately prepared?
It's a requirement.
It's a requirement. We will send an email to them and just encourage that.
We learned that at our Brown Act, or the training that we had, that we have, like any of these extended hearings, you have to study all the materials.
If you're going to participate in the hearing, I didn't want someone to say, oh, I can't participate because I didn't prepare.
Very
So-
good point. Now I understand it. So, with that being said, it sounds like we're gonna have 2 alternatives come back for alternative 1. So we would move along. Go ahead.
I just have one more question to staff. Is it, and I'm not advocating that we go down this road, I'm more curious, is it possible to consider a required percentage of affordable, and there's a mechanism for them to get out of that requirement, so it's essentially kind of a reverse? Is that possible at all, given the current county code?
That raises some interesting issues. That's called inclusionary housing. We don't really have an inclusionary housing requirement. Sometimes inclusionary housing is upheld, sometimes it's not. I'm going to look at county council and see if they want to add anything to that, but that's broaching on dangerous ground.
So then if we went back down, at the bottom of page 2, 62.3.3.1.2, I think there was some language that needed to be changed. Scratch out emergency and put in tiny, and then I have a note here that's something about county code. We would get rid of this section define. Is that correct?
Yes. You've moved down beyond where things are permitted to 3.3.1.
Yep.
So I'd like to, before you get down that far, I would like you to consider the zones where tiny house villages are principally permitted, and see if you would like to consider adding C1, C2 into the list of principally permitted uses, or areas where they're principally permitted.
Just really quick, could you pull up the maps that you generated for your presentation? Is that possible for this?
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you, and I also really appreciate you putting those together.
I'm just gonna ask a clarifying question while you're pulling up the presentation. Community commercial, that includes churches, right? This is more for the emergency housing, but when we're talking about C2, community commercial, does that include? What is the zoning designation for churches generally, would be another way to ask.
Typically, it's multifamily residential.
Okay, thank you.
I don't see a concern on adding C1 and C2 personally, and I would be in favor of that.
Are you suggesting those would be added as principally permitted or?
As principally permitted, yes. And part of the rationale for that is we're presupposing what the commission and the board will do with an ordinance that we've already vetted with you, which is to allow residential in C1, C2 zones.
Okay.
So it's really just being consistent with the direction that we're trying to go in to make sure that we're creating more opportunities for housing development. And frankly, what this also does is that particularly in South County and in North County, where there's more limited R3, R4 zonings, the commercial spaces would then become also opportunities to develop these.
Go ahead. I'm also in favor of adding in the commercial zones.
I agree.
Commissioner Scavdall, commercial zones.
I'm okay with it.
I'm hesitant because my worry is, I don't know what my worry exactly is, but I'm just hesitant to transition too much commercial into residential because it could lead to a problem, and sometimes they aren't compatible uses. That's where I personally feel like a CUP or a special permit, so then there's some sort of discretion or oversight with the development standards or the compatibility. That's my only hesitation, but also, as the director said, there's not a large line of people that are knocking at the door at the building and planning department to develop housing right now. So I'm totally fine being the minority on that.
Well, yeah, that's kind of why I'm on the fence. I said I could be okay with it. If you're actually trying to find property developed commercially in this county, there's not a lot. So so taking it up for tiny house villages could preclude future development of commercial space, but that's my concern. But at the same time, I have to balance that with the need for housing. So
That's right.
I'm on the fence.
I'm kind of like coin flip, like special permit, CUP type thing, so that way there's discretion. But it doesn't matter. I mean, go ahead, Director.
If I could try to maybe put weight on one side of the scale and not be too much of an advocate, when you do make them conditionally permitted, you're adding discretion. So part of the struggle that you need to think about is that if you want to make these happen, you take away constraints. And one of the ways to reduce constraints is to take away discretion. Because when you have discretion, as was pointed out earlier, you could have a room full of people.
Frankly, probably less in a commercial district than in some neighborhoods, so.
Yes,
That's-
yes. It sounds like, from what I'm hearing, it's like 4.1 maybe, 3.75, 1.25. So I would say, I mean, when you bring it back, probably include it.
Okay.
That's what I'm hearing. And I don't want to speak for the commissioners that are absent, but I think the 4 might maybe increase. Commissioner Curriasi?
I think we should have the presentation to share.
I'm sorry, I keep seeing it on my screen here and then I don't look up there. So then I'm thinking it's, my apologies.
It's okay. Yeah, I think that makes sense to me to include it for the next meeting. And then also what was mentioned was inclusion of C3 in a conditional use. And I am also in favor of that, and I'm curious if that should be included as well.
We'll do that.
As long as it was conditionally, it'd be a conditional use, then you would have those, design standards and, heavy industrial, and if it isn't compatible, it's not gonna work out. But if it's compatible, somehow it saves the rezoning and all that.
Right. Which map did you want to look at?
I honestly am not sure. I just wanted them up for the discussion of our zone, the zone areas that we were talking about, or have access to them in case they were useful.
Okay. Well, I have them now, so I'm going to go back to the ordinance.
And while you're doing that, can I make a proposal under 62.3.3.1 water and wastewater, which I think is where you're headed?
Yes.
I think we can simplify this and just have one subsection that just says in tiny house villages, tiny houses and movable tiny houses shall connect to public water and wastewater systems where those services are available. And on-site wastewater treatment and water supply that meets county code will be allowed where public services are not available. We'll just do it in one paragraph.
Sure.
For me, including the language of within an urban service area, tiny houses and movable tiny houses shall connect to public water and wastewater systems where those services are available. Including the within an urban service area part is important to me, because I think that an urban service area really defines where you are and are not going to find water and wastewater systems. So it takes a lot of the heartache, for lack of a better word, lack of clarity that can sometimes happen when you're looking at a map and trying to figure out what it means to have water and wastewater systems available. If you are not in the service area, it's a very clear delineation that water and wastewater service is not available to you.
Yeah, I think we can, if the commission's okay with that, we can add that in. One of the things we will need to do is define urban service area. One of the things we're really trying to get at there was in areas of community service districts. So we could either use community service district, or we can use an urban service area and then define that to include community service districts or areas where there is a water and sewer system available.
That makes sense to me. I thought urban service area was defined already?
I think it's defined in state law.
I think it's important, regardless of whether it's in an urban service area or not, if public water and sewer is available, they should connect to it.
Yeah, guess I'm kind of losing some of the nuance because I would agree that if it's available, it should be connected to. So I'm just not, maybe I'm just not following the importance.
I think when it gets down to what you mean by available, and I think like adding that being within a urban service area means that it's available, because like when you think about whether or not water service is available, is it available because there is a pipe nearby? Is it available because you're within a water service provider's jurisdiction? Is it available because, like, could you make the argument that it's available even though you're a street over from where the water service provider has their jurisdictional boundary? And arguably, according to state law, it's not available, but if you were to be a layperson and look at the map, you'd be like, but the water pipe's right there, it's available. So it's a very minute distinction in planning land.
Yeah, if I could, the nuance that's being addressed here is that in the building code, if you're within 300 feet of the service, you've got to connect. What this would do is that if you're within the service area, you've got to connect, even if you're 305 feet or more. So that's the nuance of what's being discussed.
The answer is probably no, but is there any way to get an idea of what land that would apply to? Like, is it, 0.05% of service area is outside of that 300, or is that?
Well, given the fact that we are trying to target R3, R4, C1, C2, most of those will be in areas that are served by Community Services District, what would be defined as an urban service area. Chair, I don't know what the consensus is.
I don't either, and I just got reminded of something, and I personally feel before we got into this language, I thought I heard the consensus might be leaning towards if the site can show that it can handle its own septic, to allow them to handle their own septic. But we've had a lot of conversations now that we've gone back to this phase, so I'm unsure as well.
I think we're in agreement that we want the most cost-effective solution, right? And so I share Sarah's concern. I don't have a problem with the wording, including within urban service area, if that helps define that. But all we're saying is that if public water and sewer is reasonably available, connect to it, and if not, put in a system that meets county requirements. So I think, aren't we generally in agreement on that?
Yes.
Okay.
So I have to bring this up, and maybe it's inappropriate for me to bring it up because I own TPZ land, but I'm just going to ask this question that I've been asked by a handful of people: why isn't TPZ land allowed under conditionally permitted or included?
The requirement for TPZ land is that the activities need to be consistent with producing and harvesting timber. And arguably putting a tiny home village in the middle of a forest is not consistent with producing and harvesting timber.
If it was sustainable forestry management. It's a slippery slope is what I heard you say. I won't go any deeper because there's a caveat of a housing area that one of the persons that we're talking, never mind, I won't even go that far into it. I'm done, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I actually appreciate you bringing that up because at the last hearing, there was a TPZ conversion that came up and my concern was, are these lands ever monitored to ensure that they're complying with timber harvest or is this just a tax break? And so that would be, if this avenue was to be pursued for tiny villages, that would be my primary concern.
I hear it. CAL FIRE does regulate them pretty well.
So I think we're clear on what to do with 62.3.3.1.
Yes.
Energy, is the grid power or renewable appropriate?
I'm good.
I'm not hearing anything. I'm going to assume yes. Access, 20-foot wide road.
It's fire safety.
Yep. Addresses, parking. This is one that deserves some consideration. You did get some comments indicating the need to perhaps reduce parking on site. One strategy could be to leave the parking requirement the way it is, but then allow that to be incentives in an alternative for increase in density.
I think the less parking requirements, the better in this kind of situation. If we were, I also like the idea if the commission does decide to have parking requirements to go the route of incentivizing density with reducing parking requirements. I am a little confused with, let's see, is it 62.3.3.5.1 where you essentially are adding parking space requirements when it's transitional housing. Transitional housing is often folks, in my mind, has more folks who probably don't have access to a vehicle, and therefore you'd probably need less parking requirements in that kind of situation, not more parking requirements.
So, agreed. This is, I think, a recitation of what's in the existing ordinance, and we'll look at reducing that if the commission's okay with that. Because most people in transitional housing probably don't have cars.
I guess I just add, when you're looking at it, maybe consider I think it was called the safe parking, I'm blanking on the name, that was in Arcata that recently lost its funding. Maybe speak to them about the number of folks that they were seeing that actually do own cars, because I completely get your point, but I also don't want to see people have to potentially give up their most valuable asset. So,
Okay. So you're talking about Arcata House Partnership?
yes, and they just recently lost their funding, so I'm just curious
For their safe parking.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're talking about something drastically different here. The transitional housing would be a type of housing whereby people are transitioning from various states of homelessness or out of a unstable situation into a more stable situation.
Right.
And so this is a place where they're living and being worked with and given care and counseling.
I guess I could, in reading the North Coast Journal article, I could envision many of those folks had to live in their car and may have ended up at the Arcata facility. And so I was just saying they might, though, that agency might have an idea as to what an appropriate number would be.
Okay.
Anyone else have, go ahead.
I also am interested in reducing the parking requirements to the extent we can. I I'm actually interested in proposing a parking maximum rather than a minimum, and let the developer assess their expected parking needs depending on who they're targeting their development to. So I'd basically interested in thoughts on a maximum parking space of 1 per unit, and it would be able to go down from there. It would be up to the discretion of the developer.
So maybe I heard you wrong, but I was kind of translating in my mind that you were saying establish a lower maximum than 1 per unit, and then they'd need to justify installing more.
No, I was proposing that it would be a parking maximum of 1 per unit. And I also liked the, in 3.5.2, the parking need, a parking study, allowing a parking study. So having a maximum of 1 parking space per unit, and submission of a parking study to justify otherwise.
Okay.
I also have one other thought, which is including bicycle parking in some fashion. So either a minimum or a maximum bicycle parking requirement as well.
So would your request not be satisfied with alternative 2B?
Because of the within 1/2 mile of public transit, that's correct.
So what if we stuck with 2B but workshopped the 1/2 mile?
Yeah, I think I would be interested in talking that option through, yep.
I don't think I can support your maximum proposal, because as I interpret that, it means that as a developer, I could put in a tiny house village with no parking. That's what you're saying. I think that would be highly impactful on the neighborhoods where the tiny house village is located. So I can't support that.
That's kind of the way I was leaning, but I thought that maybe alternative 2B would be a good middle ground, because it would require some, but then has a 70% a fairly substantial reduction. So maybe if we could work on alternative 2B.
I'm personally for the tiny house village. I'm not comfortable going below the 50% parking, 2A, just because the impacts on neighborhoods, what I see a lot of times with these, there's a lot of developments, not like all over the state, when you travel around and they're like, oh, that's a great housing complex. Oh, you can't find parking for a 1/4+ mile anywhere. So then, especially when it's close to like business districts or anything like that, then all of a sudden you can't find parking to utilize the businesses in the area. So that would be my hesitation there. I understand not everyone has vehicles, but in some households, people have multiple vehicles, even in the lower income thresholds. Everyone's got to have 2 jobs and they work different ends of the county type thing. So transitional housing, I would definitely be interested in entertaining some sort of lower parking threshold, or I'd be okay with, entertaining that, because the need for the parking spaces may not be as extreme. And the other thing that I've heard from public comment and fellow commissioners is what could be done to lower the cost of producing or developing these transitional housing units. So parking, asphalt, base rock's expensive. So keeping that in mind. But as far as just for the tiny house village, 2A would be the highest of my comfort level, I guess I would say. But it seems like we'll have more alternatives next time we come back to.
I'm also supportive of some reduction in the parking requirement, like alternative 2A. I like the idea of bike racks, which is included in 2B. And I would also like to see not just within a public transit stop, but maybe also within a half mile of a commercial shopping area that includes groceries. 'Cause I don't think that living in a rural space where you have to ride the bus and cart groceries and those types of things, I just don't think people are going to do that.
I agree with that, but I think a half mile to groceries might be a little close and severely
well.
restrict. So if we could just workshop the half
I'm
mile.
fine with, yeah.
I think a bit of a concern of us sort of projecting what people are willing to do. And I do have concern about the number of parcels that are actually available for development within a half mile of a public transit. I don't think what's principally permitted, there are that many options. And yeah, I think we should leave that as much open to the residents who are choosing to live there as we can.
Commissioner West?
I agree with Commissioner Kiriazi. I also just wanted to add, I am also in favor of the bike racks. I have some hesitations around considering a grocery store in the in the location of something and what it can and cannot do, simply because businesses are so ephemeral. They come and go, and to really hang your hat on a business being located there is precarious.
Yeah, I'm just looking for ways to justify reducing the parking requirement. And in my view, if there isn't commercial resources and shopping within a reasonable walking or biking distance, people are going to have cars. And we need parking. So that's all I was trying to do here, is figure out, well, what is that and what's a reasonable criteria for which to minimize and reducing parking. And I don't think just having a bus stop within a half mile is going to be enough.
Yeah, I think also, yeah, I definitely hear you. I think we definitely need to be mindful of the potential for cars spilling out off of the property as a potential impact to the surrounding area. But I think also just advocating for recognizing that people are creative, and there's a lot of people that choose to be creative, and they can do grocery shuttle programs, and they can do all sorts of creative things. So I think trying to keep in mind that the goal here is to allow flexibility and open up development options.
And the last thing I'll throw out there is, I guess somehow I read these, and somehow for some reason I thought 2A also included bike parking or bike spaces, but in like a fifth read it doesn't. So I'm guilty of doing that sometimes. So I think I personally feel, I don't know what the rest of the commission, if there was any type of reduction more than 25% parking, that there would need to be some sort of mindfulness of other modes of transportation such as bikes, and somewhere to be able to park those, because I don't see, if we have a tiny house, that the parking's going to be able to be inside the house for a bike.
just to clarify, are we just requiring a bike rack in general, like it's the developer's choice, or are we going further to require like a lockable bike cage or anything like that?
I think both are on the table right now, and maybe you want to give additional credit for a locker. But I would caution, if we're trying to keep these affordable, that lockers cost more than just a designated facility.
I guess just a thought I wanted to put out to the commission. I mean, that's a lot of reason why people often, there's hesitation that bikes will be stolen. There's a lot of part theft, that sort of thing. So I don't want someone, if that's their mode of transportation, and they have to park outside to experience that. So I think, a locker would certainly be safer. But as Director Ford said, that costs more money. So I don't know where I stand on it, just putting the thought out there.
It's a tough one to figure out how affordable housing and people, and what's all gonna work, and then what's gonna work for decades versus what's just working for a couple years right now, and then everything changes. So what I kind of heard is more alternatives for parking, and we'll decide that at another meeting. Is that, everyone's good with that?
I guess, can you clarify what are more alternatives? Are we modifying the existing alternatives?
Yeah, I think that existing alternatives probably fail for one or more reasons, but there are constituents of the existing alternatives that do have some support. So we'll try to remix and match these and provide some alternatives that may work. It sounds like there was a higher consensus leaning towards the 50% reduction with bike racks or bike lockers or some kind of improved bike storage facility. I mean, I'm not entirely sure of this, but for people that really commute on their bikes, they probably want to keep their bike in a pretty secure place. So we'll experiment with some different things and see if we can't find some other measures that have been used elsewhere that may be creative, or see if we can't find some creative solution ourselves.
I would also be open to like a tiered approach where the baseline is a bike rack, but then there's an additional incentive for the improved bike storage, and then it's kind of the developer chooses their own adventure.
And then the other thing too was an alternative for reduction in parking for transitional housing.
Just a couple more questions. Is senior citizen housing defined somewhere?
Yeah, that actually does, I think, came out of the ordinance.
Okay.
And so where we won't have it in here unless it's an outright reduction.
Okay. And then I do have to say I'm somewhat intrigued by the maximum parking idea. I just didn't like the idea that it would go to 0 if we just said, so I am somewhat, I'm not saying that I'm not supportive of limiting it to 1 parking space per unit as a maximum. But,
Get closer to the mic.
but I just wanted some boundaries on the minimum as well.
Would there be interest in setting the minimum to 1 spot per 2 units? That's the starting point.
Yeah, yeah,
From
the
what-
50% reduction essentially.
Starting
Maximum.
at the 50%.
Yes.
I mean, I think that we hear, or I've heard that we could drop the parking, but I think it's the the distance to the transit station or what's the public transit stop. But then I also hear your concern that that's a very limiting factor. So I think we need to dive into that one a little bit more. Maybe staff can bring back, like, how many of the, what was there, 800 and something parcels that would be available, I think? Of those, how many of them are within a half mile? I think that would be something that's, so then we're looking at some data rather than just basically guessing at this point. So then we could have an idea, or at least informed, more data to try to make a more informed decision.
And I think just one more comment, that keep in mind that this is a minimum, right? So it, potential that a developer could develop more parking.
Mm-hmm. I do understand that part. Are we good on parking for the time being, so we can move to waste removal and composting?
Any concerns or with the waste removal and composting requirement? It seems like a unique requirement, but this really is where the state law and the climate action planning is moving, is to separate out compost and recyclables.
I guess my question on that is the separated organics, but if there's no composting facility, what's the point?
So state law currently requires that at some point you're separating out your organics and you're not putting them into the waste stream.
Which I understand. I know there's other counties and cities that, well, even here, that have their green waste bins, but for like an example, in McKinleyville, we don't. And so separating it out is somewhat pointless. So I guess, I don't know, if we need to add something that says separated when the appropriate disposal routes are available, or should they come available?
So if we're really just focusing on green waste at this point, I would submit that perhaps the appropriate thing to do is to say the green waste shall be addressed separately from the trash pickup, and that shall not go into the waste stream.
I think a clarification on that, on what Commissioner McFarland's asking. At some point, Director Ford, the state, it does sound like we'll be mandating everybody separate out their waste and do it. But at that point, having it here in the code would not necessarily be, like, the state will mandate it whether it's here in the code or not. So if we don't include it here, it will still happen should the state require it and the facility come online.
Yeah, and this provision really isn't trying to mandate that. It's to say that you've got to have the facilities available for that, and what those facilities look like. And so that you don't have, particularly in rural areas, you don't have a buildup of waste on the site, that it gets handled. I mean, we're not trying to get out ahead of AB 1383, but.
Thank you for clarifying that.
And if I understand this correctly, it doesn't say that compost, the residents must compost. It just simply says that compost will be handled in this way.
Mm-hmm. That's why I read it. Everyone good with that? So we can move to the open space discussion? Thoughts? Alternative 3, or leave it as it is? Commissioner Curriasi?
I like alternative 3. One minor change was changing the title from common recreation to common areas. But other than that, I also pondered reducing the minimum area to 1,500 instead of 2,000. Again, just more from trying to allow the developer the ability to make something that pencils out.
Commissioner West?
I had a similar line of thought. I think I landed on, I favor the 1,500 number, just because it is a minimum. You could always go bigger, but it does, again, just reduce barriers. I mean, like, that's potentially another house that you could squeeze in there. And
Mm-hmm.
but I do like the idea of alternative 3, just with the 1,500 number.
Mr. Scavdo?
I'm okay with this, although I did in my notes say, wow, you had 20 units or more on an acre and only 1,500 square feet of open space. It seemed like a low number to me. I don't know what they're going to be counting necessarily as open space, because there's going to be space around all these individual little buildings, because they're not going to be crammed up next to each other. So I think they're going to add all that up as open space. But it just, I'm okay with either one of these alternatives. I thought the minimum areas were small, but I can live with it.
Go ahead, Director.
And to address that, that's clearly not the intent, to allow the 3 feet between buildings as qualifying as open space. You could give a minimum dimension to the open space of, say, 30 feet or something like that. So it'd end up, if it's 1,500 feet, it'd end up being at least a 30 by 50 or something like that.
Yeah.
What if we just change net square feet to contiguous square feet, or something to imply that it was one area?
It does kind of say that when it says shared lawns, gardens, patios, et cetera, I guess. But
Unless that shared patio is the 3 feet between the
That's the way I read it. I read it as a developer, is just like personally, like, okay, I'm gonna count all these sidewalks in every square foot I can, because net, it doesn't say anything about it
that's what I'd be
contiguous.
doing. I'd say, oh,
So,
this is, yep.
I don't know, but then if you make it too much open space, you're gonna take away your design, your ability to get 30 plus units on an acre as well. So, what's our goal that we're really shooting for?
I do like the second part of alternative 3 that allows for the common buildings, because that I would be okay with that being some bicycle storage would be part of that 1,500 or 2,000 square feet, whatever we settle on. So I do value that addition.
I would be okay with rewording this a bit to make it clear that is you can't just count up the little green spaces between houses.
Or think, like, what's a minimum open space, like a contiguous space you'd be okay with, so that way they could count up the little areas, but like a 20 by 20, a 400 square foot area? I'm trying to just throw out numbers, so that way we're trying to meet like a minimum congregation area, but then also they're gonna count all those patios. I don't have a number that I am leaning towards. I do like the idea of alternative 3 as far as the common workspace. That'd be cool if they had like a 200, 300 square foot wood shop or something like that, so someone could do some sort of crafts or something like that to supplement their income, or maybe that's their only income. I don't know. Just throwing out more questions, I think.
I think I generally would like to see some sort of large contiguous open space, because I think in these tiny villages, you're trying to foster a sense of community where people get to know each other and they look out for neighbors, so you're not getting into what the alternative situation could be. And so I think by providing that space is the only way, or one of the best ways to accomplish that. So I'm definitely okay with a reduction on the 2,000, as the other commissioners brought up, but some large gathering area I think is important.
Okay. I'm just gonna throw out a hypothetical here that just came to mind is alternative 3, I'd be fine with the 1,500 square feet, remove the 2,000, but in that, add something in there along the lines of 30% of, I'm just throwing out a number, 30% of the open space must be a contiguous area. Maybe 40%, maybe 50%, whatever the commission, but just trying to throw out so that way they could make a dimension in a way.
Oh, so I was more thinking along the lines of, let's say we went with the 1,500 square feet, the 1,500 of contiguous space, however, 30% could be used for the common building, so then, or 25 or whatever percentage, so then you're down, your contiguous space might be 1,000 square feet.
But I hear you, but it's net square feet, it's not
No,
contiguous.
I'm saying take out net and
Okay,
replace
make
it.
it 1,500, okay. I'd like to give the developer a little more,
Yeah, whatever number we settle on, but I'm saying take out net, don't allow.
And I just want to say this again, I think the number's too small. So if you're in a 400 square foot house, and let's just say there's 20 of them on an acre, that's only 8,000 square feet. That leaves over 30,000 square feet of land left. Even if you said there's another 8,000 square feet of parking, I think if you're living in a tiny house, you need open space. You need a place to go outside and so I think, I said 10%, so I said, I had wrote down 4,000 square feet needs to be open space. But, and I think there's room to do it. Remember, the house footprint is not very big. So there are a lot of people living there, maybe 40. So I was going the other direction.
Yeah, I think it's a fine balance between we want to fit as many houses to increase housing affordability, but also to provide houses that are, people want to live in and that they will enjoy and make
Right.
that sense of community.
Commissioner West.
So,
I think it's valuable to create spaces that make that sense of community. I just really worry about putting too many constraints on a property,
Right.
and especially when these are properties that are not in vacuums, they already have other constraints to them on building and what can happen and where things can go. And I would just really like to reduce the barriers to building as much as possible. So I lean towards less constraints.
so can we hold with the 2,000? That would be my.
Yes. One other, just reference point, on the manufactured home parks, 1,500 square feet is the minimum there for a 5-acre minimum development. So smaller, same size for a much larger development. The difference being that each one of those manufactured homes is required to have a yard, so that is different. But I think it does still kind of present some context.
So I, after hearing everyone and really thinking about the numbers, I think I agree, get rid of the net, and it's gotta be a contiguous area, and whatever that square footage is, if it's 1,500 or 2,000, like, but I would agree with that, it's gotta be a contiguous area, because if, although, you're gonna have to remember that it's gonna get more challenging to get like 40 units on an acre with that.
Right.
So, but maybe that's something they could, get a concession, is that the right term?
Incentive.
Incentive, yes. Go ahead,
Do
Commissioner.
we have a minimum lot size for a tiny house village?
Oh, that's a really good question.
No.
I think that's where, for me, some of these hesitations come in terms of like, when you're talking about a perfect acre, thinking about 25% of, thinking about a contiguous space being feasible is very feasible, but when you're thinking about a quarter of an acre and a much smaller, and then trying to fit all of your parking requirements, all of your building requirements, your driveway, and a specific size community space, it becomes really challenging and limiting on where you can site these.
But nothing, just on the driveway thing, nothing stipulates that it has to be door-to-door driveways, right? They could have communal parking at the front, right? Okay. So I guess based on your comment about the minimum lot size, I'd be open to doing some sort of percentage math, like the number of units dictates the amount of open space.
It's already scalable. The open space is per acre, so if it was a quarter acre, it's a quarter of this, 400 square, 375 square feet, whatever it is. So it's not, I don't think I think it's scalable. I'm just saying, if it's a smaller parcel, they'll have less open space, obviously, a smaller piece, but they'll still have to have something.
Maybe it's a matter of just saying that clearly in the something about the scalability.
I think it says that.
Alternative 3 is scalable.
Both of them are.
Yeah.
It says per acre.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think we've got it. We'll get rid of the net.
Yeah.
We'll come back with a contiguous area.
So can we move towards, does anybody have any concerns with I guess the next one would be the privacy thing. Go ahead.
Sorry, I just had one other question for Sarah on that. Did removing the net, did that align with your last comment, or did it conflict with it?
I think it aligns with it. To be frank, my brain is moving slower than I'd like at the moment, so I'm still percolating on it, and I think it addresses it. Thank you for checking.
I thought I heard that you were good with that, so. The privacy part, everyone good with that? Skirting, foundation, we're good with?
We don't talk about setbacks or distance between tiny homes or anything like that. So I appreciate the privacy part about windows, but is there any minimum space? Is that a building code requirement or
It's going to be building code requirement.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Curriasi?
On the skirting requirement, I understand where it comes from, and but I'm curious if that could be removed, if there was interest in removing that solely coming from just reducing one more potential cost.
For me, for me personally, actually, I'll listen to everyone else first, Commissioner West.
I think it's a hard one. I see why it's there, but I've also seen a lot of lovely pre-built movable tiny homes that you can see the wheels, but it's not a detriment to the aesthetic. So I think I lean towards less barriers and removing that piece personally.
I'm not against removing it, and the pro of removing it is it's one less place for trash or things to be collected and hidden behind. So I could go either way on that.
Mr. Scavdall?
I think it's just an aesthetic thing, which I guess it's just aesthetics. So of the people that are occupying the units, if they care or not, I suppose they can put skirting around it. I don't know if it's an issue for people driving by or looking at it, so I don't think it's important and it necessarily needs to be added.
So for me, what I was gonna say, and I remembered I had to wait for you all to speak. I go back to aesthetics and curb appeal and those comments that I heard from people that are living in community areas and could be impacted, you know, so I'm hearing parking and like aesthetics, compatibility with the neighborhood, so I'm gonna lean towards that. And, I'm not trying to stop any development, but I wanna make sure it's mindful of the community it's going into. So, but I'm also, I just heard a 4-1, so I'm also not gonna be like, you know, it's gotta stay in there, so. So I guess we'd have an alternative to remove it or not remove it with the other two.
I mean, if it's the consensus right now to remove it, we'll just remove it. Moving down to foundation.
I don't have any.
And or paved or alternate pad.
I guess I'm gonna come back to this. The only, and again, the building department may have something to say about this, but, tires don't last forever. So partly that's what the skirting does, is protect them from sun damage, but, so this says if the wheels are removed, so again, we're leaving that up to the developers, whether or not the wheels are gonna be removed or not. So the state or the building department doesn't require wheels to be removed or a foundation or any anchoring structure for these. They just park a trailer.
So this is a little bit of new ground that we're struggling with, in all honesty, because normally a manufactured home is regulated by HCD if it's put on a foundation. If it's left on the wheels, it's licensed through DMV. And HCD, to this point, published a memo back in 2016 saying, oh, we don't have standards for tiny homes. So we're struggling with the fact that there's no guidance there on that.
Mr. West. Commissioner West.
Commissioner Scavdell, do you have more to add to that thought?
Go ahead.
I just wanted to say that I'm excited that we are trying to thread this needle and find a solution and not just saying no to this type of housing. It's becoming more popular and more available, and I appreciate that while it might not be perfect, like we're trying to make more options available.
When we get, are you guys good in the foundation and the paving area? And then, go ahead, Commissioner.
Sorry, just one question. The section titled paving, the intent is not that asphalt is required there. Is that correct, or it is?
No, we modified that to make sure that it wasn't asphalt.
Okay. Is it okay to use the term paving? Is that confusing, or is it?
We could take paving out and just call it alternate pad.
Okay.
It is clear that the parking area of the movable tiny house shall include a compacted structural base capable of supporting the weight of the movable tiny house, so. And then when we get to mechanical equipment, we agreed that we were gonna change the language there. Is what I
Yes.
heard staff. Okay. Design standards, anyone have any red flags there or comments? Dependent unit villages. We're good with everything until alternative 4? And that's where we're discussing, or is pull up before that?
I would advocate under general provisions that we make the same changes here that we did with tiny home villages in terms of where they're allowed.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. Sorry, I was under the impression if we made it in that spot, we would just kind of change as needed throughout the ordinance.
Appreciate that.
So, Commissioner,
We had some discussion earlier about trying to figure out how many bathroom facilities there need to be, and also the kitchen areas. We're kind of silent to that. What is a kitchen area? And are we going to get into the details of specifying, you know, how many refrigerators, sinks, and stoves per unit, or I don't know what,
I
you know,
I
don't
would
know what to do there.
generally lean against doing that. I think let the developer choose on that. I think what one person defines as a kitchen unit could be a countertop, and another would want a chef's kitchen. I just don't want to put more restrictions there.
One of the things that we were thinking about is the possibility of giving the developer an option at the time they come in with building permits to declare and demonstrate what they're going to do, to either provide a kitchen facility that would be able to serve people where it's congregate dining, or if they're giving the opportunity for people to have their own kitchen facilities that they demonstrate there's a sufficient number of stoves, refrigerator storage that would allow people to be able to fix their meals. And you know, I know it probably isn't as specific as identifying a number of kitchen facilities, but it probably does make sense to make sure that there's sufficient water closets for bathrooms, and that it's more than, like you said, a countertop with a hot plate.
Yeah, I had the same thought as well. And I kind of perused to see if I could get any insight from federal low-income subsidized housing requirements. And I didn't get much other than they do not allow hot plates. That is not a substitution for a stove. I was hoping to find some sort of minimum cubic feet of refrigeration space, but I did not find that. But I think what I'm saying is overall, I'm in favor of exploring a little bit more if it makes sense to be more specific here.
Yep. Okay.
so is that
I need to just
a request for a
address something.
5-minute break?
Yeah, I need to address something at home real quickly, but you can either continue without me and I'll be right back, or
Let's do a 5-minute break. I think I could refresh my brain, so let's do
Okay.
8:38.
Recording in progress.
So we're coming back from a quick break, and if memory serves, we're at the discussion of alternative 4 and common appropriate kitchen and common facilities.
I think it's really hard, I recognize it's hard for all of you to try to make a decision or talk about this without us having given you some things to think about. And perhaps what we really need to do is come back with some alternatives that give some numerical standards to kind of weigh.
I think that would be good. Personally, I learned that my experience at the children's house, there's like a shared common area, and everyone had a cabinet, a locking cabinet, and it's certain, like a drawer in each, in the fridge and stuff like that, and totes basically that were locking, had little key things. So I think like a cubic area or something for refrigerated space and dry storage space would probably be good to have as a minimum, just so that way it would be really unfortunate for a developer to build something like this and then say an inequitable amount of storage space for like maybe the lower income housing parts or something like that. I would hate to see something like that. So some sort of minimal. Everyone good with that? Oh,
Yep, would be good.
good. So we can move on to, go ahead.
Just one other question on it, the water and wastewater and trash requirements, that also is intended to be a flow down from the previous section?
Yes.
In both these sections where we talk about this, we always say with running water, which I kind of thought was a little bit odd even, but if we're gonna say that, should we specify that they have to provide hot water?
Well, technically, if you're, I mean, isn't that health code? To have hot water to wash your hands?
Yes, I believe it is.
Okay.
So it's a building code requirement, basically, you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess it's an interesting point though, because I did notice, like, for example, camping areas, it does specify hot water requirement. So I guess maybe just double confirming that that is a health code requirement. It specifies hot water just in the camping areas. So yeah, it's a great question.
So I think that gets us through everything. Are we gonna go through definitions and all that kind of stuff, or is it?
Well, I had one more question.
Yes.
Before, of what's not in here. And I noticed that in some of the code sections that we're modifying, for example, multi-family housing, there is actually, it talks about pets and how many pets per unit, and I just had a question. In these tiny house villages, are we gonna get into that, and should we say only one pet per unit or something like that? To again, and help control numbers in neighborhoods where you could have these tiny home villages. And assuming each unit has 1 or 2 pets, we're talking about a lot of pets in a neighborhood.
Oh, yeah.
And noise complaints and barking and this and that and everything else. So is that something that should be in here? Is a question I'm asking.
With the changes that have been made, it probably makes sense to. In the R3 and R4 zone, as you mentioned, there are limitations on the number of pets. But in the commercial zones, there are not. In the U zones, there are not. In the MU zones, there are not. So the question is do you want to just simply be consistent with what's already in the R3 and R4, which I think is 2 pets per unit, or do you think for a tiny home, that's too high, or do you want to do something else?
I think consistent with R3 and R4 personally.
People love their pets, and there are all sorts of situations where I could see justifying going over 2 pets per a unit. So I really shy away from limits wherever possible. I also am curious what defines a pet. Is a snake a pet? Is a bird a pet? Is a cat a pet? I remember a time when the city of Eureka tried to modify its pet codes, and it was one of the more controversial topics to ever come through, and they ended up dropping it because people are very passionate, and there are just all sorts of circumstances that come up. So anyways, I hesitate to limit pets and leave that to the landlord to figure out, or the neighbors among themselves. Sorry, one more question. Are there limits on pets in single-family residential areas?
Yes.
Are they also 2 pets per unit?
No, it's higher. I believe it's either 4.
Seeing as no one's jumping to the microphone to talk about pets, for me, I think having some sort of number and consistency, the R3, R4 zones carry those numbers over, I think would be good, so there's consistency throughout. But then also, I'm the neighbor that lives across the street, and I'm really annoyed, and I swear there's 3 pets that keep coming in and out of this house, and I call code. Do I call code enforcement? Do I call the sheriff?
Code enforcement. Have you?
No,
Or I
I'm just.
shouldn't
I'm just.
ask that,
I'm,
sorry.
No, it's fine. I'm just saying,
The
like.
way you're looking at me.
No, I'm saying that across from the hypothetical
Yeah.
development, tiny house village. So then it becomes a code enforcement issue, and then you become the community police with a tight budget. Sorry, I probably shouldn't have said the last part, but
that is true. But the reality is that if you said 2 pets to be consistent, and somebody had 3, but they were like loving little pets that everybody in the community loved, nobody complains. But if they're aggressive, mean pets that tend to chase other people around, and there's 3 of them, and there's a complaint, then there is something that should be done, because it is a nuisance.
so by carrying that over, it would create a baseline for something to attempt to enforce.
It creates an enforcement level that allows the county to address a situation if there is a situation that is disrupting the neighborhood.
Okay. I'd be good with 3 and 3, 4.
Again, I brought it up, but, and only because I saw it in these other zones. But then when I think about this, this is a tiny house village. These aren't gonna be fenced lots or yards, small homes. And, I'm trying to put myself in the place of the neighbors and that are gonna be standing here at some point in the future. And, I think at a minimum, it should be, at least consistent with the current zoning ordinance in other places. And I would say as a minimum, because I think this is a different type of a situation.
I could see how you could lean towards 1 per unit versus 2.
Yep. But the landlords can also set that, so,
Yes.
right, so.
And we see mobile home parks in R3 and R4 without yards.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're good on pets. It sounds like we had a consensus there. Are we going through all the definitions as well in this process?
These are proposed, so if you would like to, or yes, if you have no problem with them, we do not need to go through them.
Does anybody have any problems with the definitions? Okay, so then now we can go to the emergency ordinance. Go ahead.
A question on that from the public comment. I think there was, we heard some public comment around delaying the emergency, this portion of it. I'm not advocating for that, but I wanted to acknowledge that, and I was curious from staff if that was even an option.
Well, everything's an option. I'm sorry, I didn't mean that to come out wrong. But I think that from our perspective, state law does not limit emergency housing and the provisions of the alternative appendices in the building code to only development on public property. To be quite precise, both the state law, the county's housing crisis declaration, the county's emergency housing ordinance all say that emergency housing may be placed on public property. It does not say emergency housing shall only be placed on public property. And that may is the critical term there.
Great, thank you.
Thank you for bringing that up. And the other way that I looked at that as well is we could go through this ordinance and eventually pass it. And if there's a reason through things changing throughout, the ordinance can always be brought back. Although the Board of Supervisors would have to engage that part if it made it all the way through to pass. So does anybody have any questions with the very beginning, the purpose of these regulations, like that whole first 314-62.5? Go ahead.
I have a clarifying question that it states that all of the development types are regulated by Appendix P, but then the alternative lodge and emergency dependent both call out the specific Appendix 104 that they must comply with. So I was a little bit confused by the requirement that they comply with the entire Appendix P, and then they require compliance with Appendix P 104. And I didn't know if those two statements conflicted, or if what was the point of calling out Section 104 in Appendix P.
I think one of the sections that you're talking about is for the emergency dependent unit villages, which allows for emergency sleeping cabins, and those are defined in the appendix, and so that's why I referenced that section to say that all emergency sleeping cabins shall comply with that section of the appendices for that type of structure.
So I guess it's being clear, because it has to comply with the whole appendix anyway.
Correct.
So it's just, okay.
They're required to meet the minimum requirements of the appendices. If they want to get full building permits, they can, but this is the minimum requirement.
Okay. And then when we get to 62.5.2, and there's somewhere in here, I have a note that we need to change the language for persons experiencing houselessness. Is that?
Yeah, I think we wanted to bolster the applicability a little bit. That currently says experiencing homelessness. But there's some additional language I think we'd like to add to that. We can bring that back.
Okay. And, go ahead.
I apologize, just kind of going back to the statement as well of the minimum standards for Appendix P. So thank you for pointing that out again. So if the proposed development only meets the minimum requirements for Appendix P, then it's only allowed during an emergency shelter crisis. So that means that if it was approved during an emergency shelter crisis and then that crisis ended, then it has to go through that removal step process.
Or they could apply for a tiny house, let's say a dependent unit village, and get full building permits.
Okay. Can you clarify the full building permit process, what that means?
That requires sprinklers, Title 24 energy code, so the standards are higher.
Okay.
And then for me, the next one that I had a note on is 62.5.3.1.2. We're supposed to cross something out and it says meet state requirements and county code. I think it was like same language.
Yeah, I think we'll make the same changes there that we made to the tiny home village ordinance above. Unless, I think a question was raised about why not allow these, or actually that was the alternative villages, sorry.
Yeah. So I think our next talking point is energy, or wait, Mr. Curiosity.
When we're clarifying on 3.1.2, when we're specifying water and wastewater, when it's water and wastewater, public water and wastewater is not available, do we need to specify that the water provided is potable?
I would think the
Okay.
state requirement and county code would require that.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
I would sure hope so.
Right. Okay.
I think that question came because we specifically state that in the previous, in the tiny house village inland section, so I think that's where you were getting the question, right?
I didn't note that, but that would make sense that I'd seen it somewhere else. Yeah.
We did, you're right, there was potable water somewhere.
Yeah, so I think that was just a consistency concern.
Thank you. Yeah.
So then we get to energy. Do people want to leave the ability for emergency generator or take it away with alternative one?
I'm in favor of leaving the generator.
I'm not. I think alternative one, the source of electricity, grid power or permitted renewable source of power. If grid power is not available, I would want to see if we're going to allow a generator, we'd have to have the hours of operation and noise quiet standards for the generator. I don't think it could just run all night. Which means it wouldn't have power overnight. They wouldn't if they had solar either, unless they had battery backup, so.
Do you have a comment? Okay, so for me, the word emergency, so emergency shelter, and then generator, like anytime you're trying to, make something happen, I feel you should be able to have generator power. So that's why I was saying, and this is just for during housing crisis. So I would like to see the generator allowed in there. also, I know that there's a serious lack of power in Humboldt County for at least another 3+ years, according to some of the letters I've been given. So I wouldn't want to limit, but also I wouldn't want someone to be able to operate a facility in a highly residential area with a generator that's like 90 some odd decibels running all night long. So I guess I would ask a direct question to staff, is there any way that we could limit some sort of decibel, or what, is that a really slippery slope there?
No, that can be done, and that's something that has been done a lot in the cannabis realm, where there have been decibel limitations placed on the use of the generator. Sometimes they're put in enclosures to minimize the noise, placed in locations where they're less noticeable. One of the other options that may be here is that if we're going to leave the generator there, have it done with a special permit or a conditional use permit to at least let people know that it's coming, and if they want to contest that, allow that to occur. Or even just allow it for a limited period of time until other power sources can be made available.
For me, where my thought process is coming from is like, say a 25 or 45 kW whisper watt, even running outside's fairly quiet compared to like a Furman brand gas powered generator, or if you put on propane, it's actually even a little bit louder, one of those 10,000 watt, and it's very, very loud. So that's where my thought process is coming from. So I have a hand right here to the left.
Yeah, I think I share very similar sentiments to you, where I hate to have it be a limiting factor. But generators they vary, but they can be so disruptive. So I would be interested in having it be an option, but finding ways to mitigate it wherever possible.
I'm just curious if do we allow generators or do we regulate generators in RV parks?
The only place we regulate generators is the cannabis industry.
But they're usually just there for emergency backup. I don't think you'd see many RV parks, if any, running on generator power. They're connected to the grid, and they have a standby generator, or emergency backup generator. The way this is currently described, the generator would be the sole source of power for this emergency housing. So it's not only noise, it's air quality. You're living next to a generator. So I don't think it's great practice. I would be okay with it as an emergency backup, certainly, or maybe grid power. It's not going to be available right away, or you have to take some time to get the grid power connected or service connected or something like that. So on an interim basis, because I appreciate what you said, this is emergency housing, so maybe you can't get all the infrastructure installed quickly enough, and you had to be on a generator for a period of time. But I think that could be, again, that would be perhaps a special permit or just a request to use a generator for a month or something.
Yeah, I would generally agree with that, because when I think emergency for, there's an earthquake, so we lost power for 2 days, use a generator, but this emergency housing doesn't have that sort of like short-term emergency that we normally think of when we think of like, going to the emergency room and so I think because the emergency housing can actually be quite a long time, we should put some sort of mitigating stipulations around the generator use.
I don't disagree with that thought, and then for me, I was leaning, I think the miserable way would be lean towards some sort of decibel limit that's allowable at a property line. That's where I'm at. As far as air quality, unless it's changed, I think as long as you're under 50 horsepower, you don't have to register with air quality control. So I think for me, I'm trying to look at what the impact would be to the neighboring properties, and noise is where I think, I mean, there's places I'll tell you, I know of places that are in residential neighborhoods that don't have PG&E because whatever reason, and they run one of those loud, cheaper type generators all the time. So it just happens.
I guess I'd say if we're gonna look into the noise limit, maybe look into if hours or anything like that are appropriate to include.
The caveat I want to remind everyone though is if we're gonna have a kitchen facility, we gotta be able to make sure that we're able to keep our food cold. So that's when I hear everyone say hours of operation, I'm like, food storage, health and safety. So.
That's why you should set up your emergency housing where you have power. I mean, the housing facilities need power 24 hours a day, right? For storage, food storage, lighting, safety, security, whatever it is. So the generators, if you're going to allow generators, you have to assume they're going to be running 24/7.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think if we were to assume that and allow 24 hours, 24/7 running, then I would lean towards not allowing them. But that's what I'm considering at the moment.
So I think then we're gonna go full circle all the way back to I think we should have followed the director's direction and just said if you want a generator, special permit or a conditional use permit, and then you can hash out that discretion at that point in time with the site-specific impacts.
I agree.
I wanna learn to listen better. My apologies.
I was going to make a similar comment, and I should have listened to John in the first place.
You can always just throw a pin my way. So we're good on energy. I heard a consensus, special permit or conditional permit. Access, everyone's good with that 20-foot. Identification, letters, numbers, all that part.
I didn't quite understand the reasoning to be so specific on the lettering, whereas we're not that specific on tiny houses. I know that came from, I think, mobile house. It came from somewhere else in the code, but I don't know. It's not a big deal for me, but it felt very institutional.
Through the chair, that came through the appendices requirements. So I just decided to include that as a provision, but it's to our discretion. There's flexibility there.
Okay.
I think the point is that they don't need addresses per se, they just need identification.
Yep. Yeah, identification makes sense, but getting into the number, heights, and all that, I don't know. It didn't. But it's not a big deal for me. I'm fine to drop it as well.
For me, the way I read that part is I was thinking the potential for having a medical type emergency, so it'd be really good to have clear identifiable. That's the way I read that part. But sometimes I have a hard time threading the needle back to the other one and making sure there's parity. But you'll like this one. There's no minimum parking requirement. Everyone good with that, or do we want a minimum parking requirement? Waste removal and composting. I have a note that staff was asking us to scratch out Title 14 and put out whatever regulation applies at the time? Is that the proper?
Yes,
that I-
we'll bring that change back.
Okay. And then open space, would parity, do we want the same type of alternative as we talked about in the last ordinance, or? Commissioner Scott?
So this ordinance doesn't actually have a density description, so and I don't think it, quite frankly, I don't think it needs an open space requirement either. It's an emergency housing ordinance. Do we need to dictate, it's a temporary facility, it's emergency housing, do we need to dictate open space? We don't know how many units are on there or how dense it's developed. We're silent to that. So I didn't think this was necessary.
Mr. West? This is, I remember you had a lot of comments about the emergency one, trying to make it easier.
Yeah, and I think I fall in line with Commissioner Scabdall, where the less requirements that we put in place and allow the folks to operate the facility as to the way that they need to operate the facility. And if you can fit more people in instead of having an open space, I think that's to the greater good. So
I would say as long as it's legally allowed to remove that open space thing, I would be good with removing it, because yes, if there's, they could put up a counseling thing or any other type of more beneficial for the facility, and let them decide that, whoever's operating it.
So going back to the discussion around allowing development outside of emergency declaration, so would these potentially spill over to a development that exists out, if the emergency declaration was ended? Would we have a space that doesn't have recreation and doesn't have some of the things that we specified in the tiny home?
It would have to be re-permitted and reconsidered. And if it's in a zone where they're principally permitted, it's just a matter of reconfiguring to come into alignment with what is allowed as a tiny house village or a dependent village.
Okay, so they would just move out of this section of the ordinance entirely?
Right.
Got it, okay, thank you.
So does that mean you're good with removing the open space part? Okay. So, in the common facilities, any comments there before we get down to talking about alternative 3? Okay, so alternative 3, comments, decisions, or not decision, Commissioner West?
I think I was advocating for this language to be removed. That became alternative 3. In my view, I think I was thinking of a situation where perhaps you have shower facilities and you want to be able to provide showers to more than just the occupants of the emergency housing, where you're providing emergency housing services to the community, but like you also are able to open up some of those services to a broader swath. And so I didn't see a reason to limit that if that was something that the operator thought that they could manage and do within their scope.
Sorry, can I make a quick request to put this up on the screen, because it doesn't look like it printed out? Can you put, thank you.
So, clarifying question to staff, if that language was taken out or not used, alternative 3, it would really be the operator's discretion, so they wouldn't be bringing in more people than they thought they could handle for extra showers or anything like that. That's correct?
That's correct. And alternative 3 is the old language, and then the new language is below that at the top of the next page. So alternative 3 is an alternative to the section below.
Common bathroom facilities shall be.
Through the chair, sorry, to correct that, John, the alternative is to just remove it. It wasn't a replacement in the ordinance.
Okay.
I added it as an alternative because that is part of the minimum requirements of the appendices. And so if we decide to remove it, we just have to make the findings for that.
We've got the same number in there, though.
Do I?
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
that was an error. My apologies.
We shouldn't have anything in here that's in the appendices.
I guess I would generally agree with what you said, Commissioner West. If the operator feels that they can, carry more, if they can bring in more people and service more people, I don't see why that should be a problem.
Yeah, I think I was just looking for ways to open up possibilities, and that really only put sideboards on where we need it.
Try to help as many people as possible. So I'd be good with erasing this alternative 3 language, or not utilizing it, because it's alternative, so it's technically not in it.
I think that's valuable because it might even be something as simple as a laundry facility or,
Yeah.
Could I make a suggestion? I have some ambiguity about this. We need to understand if that could even be removed.
Okay.
That's a requirement of the appendices of the building code. And so one of the things that it's dangerous to do is include things that are in appendices, because then if you want to change it, you're changing something that's in the building code.
Okay.
And so we need to understand, I need to understand, and I don't right now, what findings need to be made when and where, if it's on a case-by-case basis or as part of the ordinance, to take that out.
We hear you.
And to clarify, to take out the alternate language?
The alternative language actually is the language that's in the appendices.
Right.
So when you're checking into that, could you see if emergency housing villages could include community facilities such as restrooms and showers for people outside of the emergency housing village?
Yes.
So they could meet these minimum standards of numbers of units, but perhaps have a community shower and restroom area.
Okay.
I would also add in laundry facilities as a potential option.
Yes.
I don't think
Yeah.
that's necessarily addressed in what we're talking about, but
Other community serving facilities or something like that. Okay.
Okay. So staff's gonna get back to us on that, so that way we know our findings or anything like that. Common bathroom facilities, lavatory bathing facilities, kitchen. People have questions, comments, concerns, clarifications. They do me to have a minimum temperature and also talk about potable drinking water there. Not hearing anyone do anything there, so emergency dependent unit villages. Comments, questions? subtractions, additions, general provisions, anything there? Development standards. Oh, the zone part, I was under the impression, or the way that I thought we changed that throughout. When we made those original changes, that would carry on throughout.
This is a more restricted zoning list than we have for tiny. Keep your mic on. Excuse me, this is a more restricted zoning list than we had for the tiny house villages.
Oh, you're right.
already. Okay, I just want to make sure we're okay with R3, R4, and mixed-use urbans as being the areas where these can be. Okay, so we're not adding the commercial areas for emergency housing.
No, I think we should, and,
With the special permit, the C3, correct?
right.
That would be my yeah.
That's kind of was my understanding that we would add
Oh,
those.
okay, got it.
The R3, R4, and then C3 with a special permit was my understanding. We kind of talked about at the beginning, though.
So that's,
C1, C2 is here.
conditionally permitted already.
Yeah.
Yep.
We're moving those to principally permitted.
Correct.
Right.
Yes, thank you for that clarifying thing there. Are we good on zoning? Development standards, anyone have anything there? Alternative lodge parks.
Yeah, I have something. I want to go back to development standards. We aren't requiring parking, but we're saying the parking area for an emergency sleeping cabin. So is that if there's parking, it needs to be on a structural base, but we're not requiring parking.
That's more for the foundation of the structure. So maybe parking is the
Oh.
incorrect term to use there.
Oh, got it.
Yeah, that's the pad area.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, if you change that to pad, that would make a lot more sense. So alternative lodge parks, I remember hearing Commissioner West.
Yeah, I think, again, thinking about making exceptions for having them located where water and sewer are not necessarily available if the site can support on-site septic and well. There are just, I understand the thought behind it, and I can appreciate that, but I also think there are a lot of places in the county that are more urban than you would expect that don't have sewer available. And for instance, Trinidad does not have a citywide sewer system. And that's just an example. I'm not suggesting that that would be the only place that these would be located, but I hate to throw up barriers if there's a site that is available that could meet the requirements of health and safety and sanitation requirements, that it just doesn't have water and sewer connection.
I would not be opposed to that, as long, I mean, obviously, we'd have to add some language in there that they would have to get the appropriate permit, and then if it's alternative lodge parks, it would be sized to 10 hookups, 20 hookups, 5 hookups, whatever it may be, and so then we're protecting the health and safety of everyone else. I'd be totally fine with that. I mean, there's developed areas that don't have the carrying capacity to add in more as well, i.e. Redway. They have 8 hookups left.
So would that be a question for you, a modification to that to allow the alternative lodge parks with a special permit in those cases, so that we would have the opportunity to do an analysis of the carrying capacity?
Yeah, I think I'm in support of whatever mechanisms are there to provide that analysis to make sure that health and safety requirements are being met. But yeah, I'm hoping we can walk the line between just totally excluding properties as being usable, if we can find a way to make them usable.
So all, as the ordinance stands now, all alternative lodge parks require a conditional use permit. So we can change it to say that it does include sites that don't have connection to public sewer, but it would still require a conditional use permit.
Okay. Then it makes it really easy to analyze the site-specific impacts. Okay. Okay, so conditionally permitted, development standards, anyone have anything in there? Other than we're modifying the language in 62.5.5.3.1.
I do think I have a clarification.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a while since we talked about this, and I know the tents, yurts, and membrane structures talking about except for where a minimum of 50 degrees Fahrenheit is required for tents to be considered a suitable sleeping space.
Oh, I remember we talked about that.
The minimum requirements in the appendix, don't they require a heater inside the tent? I don't remember the specifics, but it seemed like it was a pretty high bar.
What the appendices says is that if there are not a minimum of 50 degrees just outside, that tents are not considered suitable sleeping spaces.
So does that mean, generally in Humboldt, we get below 50 degrees for a large part of the year, so that means that tents are not considered suitable living spaces?
And that's why I added this provision in here to make that clear that we are allowing tents despite what the minimum standards are in the appendices. So it sounds like we still have to do some research on how to make those findings and what that requires. And perhaps I need to change some of the language in the earlier sections about requiring the minimum standards.
Okay, I think I would just advocate for if we can make tents, yurts, and membrane structures possible and viable, that's where I personally would lean. I would like as many options as possible for folks.
Next question. Who declares a shelter crisis?
The state first did, and then gave an opportunity to cities, counties, and city and counties to make similar declarations.
Okay,
So the Board of Supervisor declared a shelter crisis.
okay. So, and the Board of Supervisors would be the agency that would say the shelter crisis is no longer in place or
That is correct.
no longer effective? Okay,
That is correct.
all right. And should that happen, is 90 days a reasonable time frame for somebody to dismantle a site that may have been in place for some time?
It's not an absolutely unreasonable time, but it would require people to take action.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think that I would offer for thought is that I don't think that we would be ending the shelter crisis declaration if all these places were full.
Fair enough, right. Okay. Thanks, I just needed to understand how that end would come about and how much time people would have. They'd probably have plenty of advance warning.
County Council?
The other thing that could happen and hopefully won't happen is that the government code section allowing for the shelter crisis actually terminates in 2026. They will probably extend it, but right now it's repealed at that time. So that could be the other way that this could end if they don't extend it.
That's a state code, though.
It's the state code that gives the county the power to declare the shelter crisis.
But to repeal that, they would have to deal with their housing crisis. That's
Well, I
like,
think that's
yeah,
why,
no, I understand that, but I've done a little bit of traveling in the state in the last couple of years, and Humboldt isn't that bad. Movable emergency housing, so we're good there. Does anybody have any questions or comments in the definitions area? Okay, so then I believe we have done our first skim through of 2 ordinances without any like hostile arguments or inappropriate conversations towards each other, so thank you. And this one doesn't have, it's a special meeting, so we don't have anything else, so meeting is adjourned. At 9:30 on the dot, wow.
Thank you, staff, again for your
When's
excellent
our
work.
next meeting?
June 11th, or July 11th.
I think it's July 18th.
July 18th.
It would normally be the 4th and the 18th. And so I don't think you're wanting to be here on the 4th.
The 18th, yep.
No. For some reason, I wrote a note that it's on the 11th, and I've misspoke to a few people when our next meeting is, but we're good.